Hi, and welcome back to the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at eu.vc. Today, we're happy to welcome Fridtjof, Chief Business Officer and co-founder of Antler, a startup generator and early-stage venture capital firm. Fridtjof works with a global team dedicated to developing the next generation of world-changing technology companies. He oversees external activities across the firm globally and serves as a member on its investment committees. If you enjoy our content, do support us by hitting the follow button, giving us a review, and following the European VC on LinkedIn.
Fridtjof, welcome to the show. It's super nice to have you here at the European VC. How are you today?
Doing great, David, and thanks for having me on.
It's our pleasure for sure. Listen, I think we cannot start this interview without deep diving straight into, the origin story of Antler, but obviously connected to the origin story is also your story, right? So please shed some light on how this all came to be in the early days.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm from Norway and have a background working in different early stage startups in the Nordic region, consulting in McKinsey, so working quite a lot across Europe, but also studying in both the UK and the US. So quite an international background after my childhood and early years in Norway. And it's quite a lot of similarities with the other co-founders of Antler, having had quite a lot of international exposure early on. And I think that led us together and made us all quite excited about starting a firm that is really all about enabling extremely talented people to start companies in the best way possible, regardless of their starting point. Some will come with great networks and a lot of access to capital. Others will be from more remote places and maybe lack capital, network, ideas, but they are extremely driven and talented. So it's a bit of the origin of both myself and a number of the others. And I will say that especially my years at Harvard Business School formed a lot of the ambition to create something truly impactful. I think if it's one thing that you as entrepreneurs are really good at, it's to think very big and aim really high. And I think that's a very good inspiration for a lot of entrepreneurs elsewhere, that if you're going to spend the next 10, 15, 20, maybe more years working on something, you might as well aim really high and try to make a big impact. If I translate that into how do we get started and what were we looking to achieve, it really came down to a few things. But ultimately, we wanted to, on the one hand, get access to great opportunities to make good investments. We thought it's interesting to invest in startups. It can be a great business model if you get access to great entrepreneurs. But on the other hand, growing up and having worked in different professions, we saw a bigger problem perhaps, which was around how can we lower the barrier for great people to get started on their companies. Time and time again, we met people who either didn't have the time, or they had no good co-founders, or they just didn't have the financial situation to dedicate full time on starting a company. And we thought that was a shame, because despite all the talk about entrepreneurship, and we read about, especially nowadays, entrepreneurs all the time in every single type of media, not just the more traditional startup media, the world needs more entrepreneurs, and there's no shortage of problems needing to be solved. And I think if you look back in history, the real groundbreaking innovation has come from entrepreneurs, not from governments or not from sort of overly structured big programs. And that's why I think it's so important. And hopefully we can play a bit of a role in that, to just encourage more talented people to be entrepreneurs and lower the threshold for them to get started, and just sort of try to 10x, if not 100x, the number of talented entrepreneurs who want to create something really impactful.
I have to ask, and this question comes a bit from a place of ignorance. When you guys started out, were there any kind of other organizations doing anything similar to what Antler became? Like today, there's quite a few players that have this very kind of interesting play in the early stages that are somewhat comparable to you guys. Back in the day, I actually don't know. Were there anyone that you guys were looking at as a benchmark that you took some inspiration from, or was it really just kind of you grew into being this machine by a mix of serendipity, but also following the opportunities?
I think for sure we drew inspiration from a lot of places, and depending on what part of the model that you look at, there's different peers, I will say, and different learnings to be drawn. I think lots of organizations are really good at identifying talent and attracting talent. Lots of organizations are good at making investments. Lots of organizations are good at creating scalable support for a quite decentralized organization like ours, who are in 25 cities across 6 continents now. So we pulled on learnings from different companies and different players. I think in terms of backing early stage entrepreneurs and trying to back talent, there's lots of regional and local initiatives, I guess, that would fall within the same category. I think what's interesting with what we have created is that it's really global and at a very big scale. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for us to not just provide good local or regional support, but to really pull on what's now a truly global footprint to create as much value and support as possible to founders from an early stage. So that's really where we are now, 5 years into this journey, that we have the scale. We have backed now more than 650 portfolio companies across all corners of the world. But it's really an exciting time in our journey, because we now have the scale and starting to get a strong brand name to be able to create more value than we would have been able to if we were just working on this in Singapore or just working on this in London or Oslo, for example.
I'm curious if you could dive a bit into Antler thinking around how quickly you wanted to scale and what structure you wanted to do it with, because there's many different ways to scale a VC firm. You've scaled rapidly, so that's the one thing. That's typically not what you see with VC firms. If you think of Sequoia today, who's huge, they didn't move quick at all in the beginning, right? So I'd love to hear, the mindset that you came with and how you thought about that rapid expansion. It's not something we typically see in VC.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a new take, I will say, this speed and scale, but it was also quite deliberate when starting out, because this scale, even though it takes a lot of work to establish it and then obviously maintain it and pull value from it, it does provide more opportunities to be valuable to entrepreneurs. And I think that is a really important thing for venture investors and investors in general, that you want to be value adding. I guess at some point you can always win a deal if you're providing a super increased valuation or paying a big premium, but I don't think that's necessarily the most scalable way of building an investment strategy. What if you can create true value and become more accessible and get access to great talent and ultimately great ideas that they build? So it was a big part of our strategy to scale fast, to be able to be more competitive and be more favorable among founders. The speed was also quite deliberate, because by rapidly expanding, we attracted more talented people. And for every partner who've joined the firm, I think they brought in more learnings, they brought in more networks, they brought in more new ideas. We've also gotten more access to great potential investors, both directly in the portfolio companies and into the Antler investment vehicles. We are building a stronger brand because people are seeing Antler appear in more events, in more ecosystems, in more people's social media feeds. So you get into this virtuous cycle where things just spin faster. And the alternative, especially when you're dealing with pre-seed investing, is that it takes time, and it will take a long time for a pre-seed company to grow into being in the growth stage and to be a really successful one. So the alternative of waiting for a full fund lifetime to play out will just take very long. And I think that you will not keep on building on that momentum that you already have. So it does take a lot of effort, but if you structure it the right way, I think that you get to meaningful scale faster. And we've also been very focused on pulling out learnings for every time we've been adding a new location. And what I mean by that is we run these residency programs where founders come in, typically with very early ideas, looking for co-founders and looking for time and an ecosystem to work on refining their ideas. For every one of these cycles, which typically takes place between 4 to 6 months, we do a retrospective analysis of what worked, what was the feedback from the founders, what was helpful that we brought to them, what was not helpful, and we share that across locations. And now with 25 locations, you could argue that we're learning 25 times as fast as if we were just in one location. So the speed of learning on every single part of our setup is just much more efficient. you need to be quite structured to make that learning flow across such a big and decentralized team. But if we're making that work, which I think we are, then it's a very efficient way of growing and learning together.
And that almost leads me into my next question, which is, and I might be saying this in a bit of a provocative manner, and to some extent it's also meant as such, because I've thought that when looking at the Antler GP profiles that I see, there's almost like an Antler GP talent thesis around people coming from big consulting houses. I'd love to ask you, is this by design, or is it more, okay, that's our network, so that's why we've serendipitously ended up pretty much hiring from McKinsey, or how does that work out?
So I will maybe slightly disagree, because a lot of the early people who joined definitely are coming from some of the consulting houses, including McKinsey, of course, a big portion of the founder team. And I think it is because we knew each other, right? And we had spent time together and really saw that we can come together and create something. That's one portion of our backgrounds, and many have gone on to build great companies either before or after. If you look at what's now more than 50 partners across the Antler ecosystem, I will say that the typical profiles are people who've built or been early employees in successful startups in that region. So what we're really looking for when we are getting a new partner on board in a new location is really that they have been an operational entrepreneur or in a very early role in a fast-growing startup in that ecosystem. And that's important because they know what it takes. They can relate to founders in a good way. They also have networks in that region who can hopefully come in and help the startups. And that element of their profile is very important to us. I will say, compared to a later stage VC or a more traditional fund setup, we're probably weighing quite a lot more on operational experience in their previous roles and being able to create good operational structure, because we're dealing with so many people and so many companies. That is weighed much more than perhaps in more traditional investment setups.
When you were talking about scale, Fridtjof, in the beginning, just like 3 minutes before or so, you used a couple of interesting words. You used the word process, you used the word structure. And I think it's incredibly insightful for our listeners, them being, many of them being emerging VPs, understanding, okay, I think it will be very unlikely that any of them do not know of Antler. So I think we can skip that bit of, what is Antler focusing on and so on and so forth. I think we've done that already enough, but it's more about understanding, okay, how is it structured? Because that might have interesting learnings for our listeners, whether that's from the funds, the organization, whatever you think is most insightful. But I'd love to give you the time to deep dive a bit into it.
Yeah, and do add in, the deliberations behind it. Why did you think that this would be the best model? Why did you not go for another one? The more detailed, the better.
Yeah, I think that the way we've structured it is really built around how can we do the things locally that make sense to do locally, and then try to standardize or centralize in some way the things that we don't need to do in every location. And even if you are having a much smaller or less global setup, I think there are many ways you can think along the same lines that we have been thinking. So you can think of Antler as several different regions doing the same type of activity, which is identifying and attracting and supporting entrepreneurs, being there then as this day zero investor, backing them from the very beginning, and then following on as the companies progress and get more traction. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of things that need to be provided or to be performed by that team. They need ideally a good technology platform so that they can, in a scalable way, give feedback to teams, invite them to events, connect them to each other, just run everything more efficiently. And that is one typical area where obviously we don't want a technology and product team in 25 locations building 25 different solutions. And that's a good example where we have brought in quite a lot of people who are now optimizing the balance between what do we build in-house and what do we connect from external solutions. And most importantly, how do we optimize how this makes everyday life easier for the people operationally running each location. So that's on capital. Another element is around things like people and culture. So how do we create the same culture? How do we have the same values? How do we create good learning and development opportunities for people, even provide for colleagues who are looking to do something different, or something happens in their personal life, so they need to relocate to a different region. Maybe there are roles there that we can provide. That is an aspect where we make the people flow much more efficient by having a central people and culture function. But it's also tremendously important to create the same basis and to reiterate and build a company based on our values and our principles. It's very difficult if you don't have that central or sort of global layer to build an organization that talks the same talk and has the same values and builds a team in more or less the same way. So people and culture is an important part of creating kind of one Antler across very different markets and very different cultures. Then there's an element around the networks. So the advisors we have in one location, we can definitely utilize them and their expertise in different locations. So if you are an expert on the shipping industry in Oslo, there's no reason why, as long as you're willing to, that we can't connect you to a shipping company in Singapore that we are backing. Similarly, if you are a later stage investor in fintech based out of London, maybe you have a global mandate, you can definitely then look at fintech startups in India or in Singapore or in the US. That is also where having a support team sitting globally or centrally comes into play, because this team can really optimize how do we share that network, how do we use it in the best way. We don't want to kind of drown anyone with 100 emails a day and not be value adding that way. And all of this requires thinking, because when you make it work, it's an incredible machinery, and it's really hard to replicate or have the time to build out if you're busy doing the day-to-day execution in one of the locations. I think the list goes on in terms of marketing is another example. We can work as one team and tell one story globally rather than telling a smaller story individually in each smaller market. Talent identification, or scouting as we call it internally, is also a big part of something where we can learn by just having people sitting centrally and trying to pick up how we got to really exceptional founder talent in one location. How can we take those activities and copy paste them in other locations? You could potentially do that without the central unit, but it just doesn't become the main objective of someone in one location to pass on those learnings. People are very willing to, and it's a big part of our culture to share learnings. But if the threshold is too big to do that, it falls through and it doesn't really happen. So a lot of these functions and these examples I provided is around having dedicated people, making sure that we share and implement the best practices across locations. And in some cases, people who just need to make sure that we are pulling on the best people from across Antler and not relying on that proactively happening in one location.
On the marketing communications topic that you brought up, which, reading from your LinkedIn, it's something that you spend some time thinking about these days. I actually have a question for you, which is, if I bring what you're saying down to our world at the European VC, right? We're now 5 people. We're trying to get 6 people, and obviously one of my concerns, right, on the investment side, particularly when we're doing LP investing, is quality control, ensuring quality, but also reputation. Because I always say internally, I'm always saying, we see such a small world, we can't burn bridges, we can't say no's, but we need to do them very quickly and very well said, right? And then obviously, if I now take this and I extrapolate it to a global level, I think some of the best investors out there in terms of returns are dickheads and have terrible reputations, right? Some are super nice people. And so my view is very much there isn't a right approach. There are different approaches. But then how do you think at Antler, right, when you're onboarding a new GP for a new location? So as an example, I'm going to name him because I'm comfortable enough with him to do it. Sergio in Portugal, right? Maybe he's a dickhead with his founders. And maybe he's, you're just getting a shitty reputation in Portugal that then kind of goes into Spain, and it's kind of really not good for your brand. So how do you think about these two things on a global scale when picking these new partners and launching new locations? Reputation and quality control, of course, of the investments you're making.
And a disclaimer for everyone: Sergio is not a dickhead.
I was going to say it was a good correction, Andreas, but no, Sergio is great. And if he's out there listening, then
even though I do enjoy Sergio, so in that sense, who knows? Well,
but jokes aside, I can sort of break it down into 2 pieces. So when you're dealing with people in a very hands-on manner like we are, I think it's very important to be founder friendly and founder first. I think there's so many different ways someone can start a company, and the fact that they choose to come to Antler and work with Antler, it's a big responsibility we have to then be friendly with them. Now, friendly doesn't mean to say yes to everything or never push back or never give harsh feedback. So there is a balance there, but I think people, e.g. Sergio, who are great with people, can do that in an efficient way. And if we see that is not happening, I think it is a big responsibility for us to call that out and either change that behavior or make changes in the team, because being global, it brings with it a lot of great opportunities, but you also are working in a lot of different ecosystems with a lot of different touch points, and it's really important that everyone who represents Antler is representing Antler in a professional way, and being founder friendly and putting founders first is really the top principle we have internally. If I link that to Andres.
No, I was just about to say, I remember when you opened up your office in Copenhagen, I think I actually saw a job posting for a partner position. So, that actually surprised me a bit, in the sense that most VC hires are being done without anyone posting anything, at least for the partner level. So I'd love to hear your thinking around that. Is it a CSR thing, or is it because you actually do believe that you cannot know everyone who would be relevant in an ecosystem?
Yeah, if I take that part, I think it's quite straightforward. In the vast majority of cases, we have brought in people we have gotten warm intros to or known from our different networks. But I think that not posting it externally, you just lose out on potential people you don't know. And we don't know everyone in Denmark, and we don't know everyone in the Nordics. So it's a nice add-on. I think being transparent and open on every role you're looking to recruit never hurts. But at the same time, I see where you're coming from, because the vast majority, it is people you know or someone you know who intros you. It does, typically increase the average quality of an applicant, but it doesn't then mean that there's no good applicants coming from the general applications on our website.
Yeah. No, I just thought it was interesting to touch on. And I'd be curious to hear, what do you look for in a GP when you launch a new location? And maybe let's start with when you choose to open up a new location. Is that GP driven? So you meet someone who's absolutely crazy good in Rio, and then you see that, okay, there's a good match here, let's open up a location in Rio? Or do you say, strategically on the map, we're missing Rio, so we'll find a team in Rio? Tell us how you think about that, and then afterwards, let's go a bit into how do you then weigh the, in quotation marks, applicants for that location?
Sure. Have a list of very exciting ecosystems, and those can be in emerging markets, they can be in more established ecosystems. And the good thing with being in 2022 is there's a lot of places that are just getting started when it comes to nurturing and creating startups. I think one of my favorite stats is that in 2010, there was 22 cities with a unicorn. In July 2021, there was 170 unicorns. That number is probably bigger now, meaning that you're close to 200 cities with one or more unicorn. And that's obviously 200 cities from vastly different ecosystems. So we're bullish on a lot of different markets. And for the ones that are in that, let's call it a long list, we are quite opportunistically looking at different profiles, getting to know different ecosystems. And we spend a lot of time figuring out who's the best first partner that we can get on board. Because once we have that person, it's a lot easier to build the rest of the team. We can start to get really the ball rolling. And that dialogue or that search can take anywhere from 3 months to well over a year. We're not going to reduce the quality metric just to get going in a location. We're not rushing to open in new places, but we are putting a lot of effort into evaluating people. And in some places, we've talked to hundreds of profiles, really deep. It takes a lot of time, but it's so critical to get that right. And in other places, we've been more fortunate and found people earlier. But there's a lot of variation in how that timeline is developing. And what we look at, just to address that part, Andreas, what we look at is, again, the operational excellence. Ideally, there is a strong interest and experience on the investment side as well. In some cases, that's coming from another VC. In other cases, it's coming from more angel investing in that space. And the third one is really the culture. I mean, you need to get along well with the team. We typically spend time on the ground, both when assessing them, at least in the final stages, and then senior members of our team typically try to spend a lot of the first few weeks or months in that location as well to help with the onboarding. And that's also a good way to just build the right culture.
Yeah. I was about to ask you to kind of dive into the process of vetting a candidate, because we have so many listeners that are thinking of building a VC firm, but they don't want to do it themselves or whatever, and also who are hiring for principal or senior roles. And there, I think that you guys probably the ones with both one of the best playbooks for doing that for founders, and I imagine that you've also systematized it quite a bit for Antler Global on GP level.
So if I understood correctly, you wanted me to go a bit more into how we assess the
yeah, exactly.
partners.
What does that process look like?
Sure. So it is ultimately a series of conversations. Some of them are more case study like. So if you were starting this region, what would your 100-day plan be? What would you do? Because it's important for us to know that they have a clear vision for what they want to do. We can give playbooks for a lot of the elements, but ultimately you are starting that location, and a lot of our belief in that location hinges on you and what you think. So a lot of the conversations evolve around that. Some of the conversations evolve around obviously what you did in the past. I think like any role, we're looking at proof of operational excellence. Personally, I try to think about this airport test or whatever it's called. Is it someone you can spend 6 or 8 hours waiting on the flight with without going crazy? And it matters, because whether it's on Zoom or whether it's in person, you will be spending a lot of time with these people, and it needs to be fun. You need to have some aligned interests and obviously the same values. So I will say that it's 3 categories of conversations really. Some of them more structured around the plan. The other element more around your background. That includes obviously a lot of references, especially as you're going towards the end of the assessment pipeline, references from other people in the ecosystem, both the ones provided by the candidate, but also from our own network. Those weigh heavily. It's important that we hear good things about the candidates. And the third one is more maybe relating to my airport example, just about the culture. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is that we not only try to travel there to be in the location with the person towards the end of the assessment, but we also invite them to one or more of our offices to have them experience Antler. And I think that is an important point, which probably is very applicable to anyone hiring, which is with the best candidates, you're obviously assessing, but you're definitely selling as well. So it's a balance to find. And the best people are probably just at that edge where you really want them and they really want you. And some people you probably really want and they don't want you if you're not good at selling them what they can really get out of being part of your organization. That's a big piece I think is important to balance throughout, not just towards the end of the conversation, but you want to sell to them what they can get from you. And ultimately, any hire, right, is an exchange of time. And there's so much cool things people can do with their time. So if they choose to spend it with you, then they better have a good reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I just have one final question on this point, which is, and it comes from today, a good friend of EUVC, Stefano Bernardi, launched his new fund called Unruly Capital. And what really I loved about that fund launch was he had a super in-depth memo on, how he thinks about venture and what brought him to where he is today and all that kind of stuff. How big are you on thesis-driven GPs versus GPs that are more like, I'm in this for the investing part and I don't have as such a strong thesis on whatever vertical or whatever place in the world that I should fit, or that kind of thing? How do you think about that?
I think given our focus on the early stages and the sort of day zero investing, by default, our model is very people-driven, I would say. So it's a thesis that if we can identify and get to know and get excited about great, talented entrepreneurs, we will want to back them. When we invest at this very early stage, we know that the vast majority of these companies that we invest in will pivot significantly in the future. It doesn't mean that we're discounting the idea when we are making the investment, but who the people behind the idea are and what they stand for and what they want to do in the future weighs very heavily. So as an organization, we're very people-driven in our initial investment. As we do the follow-on rounds in later stages, it becomes much more data-driven. We see how they progress, what they're doing, and how the market is receiving their product. But that's a very different type of investment decision from the first one, which is really what makes us quite distinct in the market. At the same time, the GPs in the different markets, in varying degrees, have their own thesis on what they believe should be built, what they are excited about. But I still think that as an organization, we like to say that, you know, rather than trying to be the best at predicting the future, let's try to be the best at identifying people who can shape the future. And an element of that is, unless I know everything, or unless I'm the best potential entrepreneur in the world, how do I know that my thesis is the right one? It might be people that think about things totally differently, who will then fall outside of my area where I'm looking, because they're just thinking about it or coming at it from a completely different angle. If I identify that person and I say, wow, he's so smart, I want to back him, then I can be part of that journey. If I'm limiting myself to one thesis, especially at the early stages, I risk losing out on people who are just smarter or think about the industry in a very different way.
Yeah, interesting. While you were talking, I just realized, Stefanos Fund is not Unruly Capital, but Unruly Ventures. So just have to make that correction. To do shout out to a bro for renaming his fund. I tend to do that kind of thing. So before we can go to the quickfire round that I know that David can't wait for, I have to ask you, now that we're with one of the co-founders of Antler, where the hell did the name come from? Why Antler? Why not something else?
There's a few different reasons for the name, and the biggest reason is that antlers are the fastest growing tissue on animals with antlers. They grow out, and when they fall off, new ones grow out again. And it resembles quite nicely our residency programs, where companies grow out in all kinds of directions. And when they're growing out of our offices, we get new exciting entrepreneurs to come in and build new companies with us. The other element is that it's quite easy to pronounce and spell. And for someone with a name of mine, I've learned the hard way that that's important to think about when starting a new company in 2022, or in a modern days. And the last thing is that I think the antlers in general have a little bit of a Nordic link as well. We mentioned that some of our co-founders were from Norway, and one of our co-founders is from Finland, and so a lot of reindeer, and I guess a lot of different animals with antlers. So it's a nice link to there, even though we're obviously now all over the world. So that's the reasons for the name.
I love that, and that was a good answer. And it had nothing to do with the fact that it starts with A.
It didn't hurt, to be honest. I think that was more important before. I think I read somewhere that Amazon, for example, was very focused on starting with an A, and that was probably more important in the 90s when a lot of the lists just ran alphabetically. But I'd rather start with A than Z. But I wouldn't say it was the key driver. But you're named Andreas, so you've always had it easy.
I've always been the first one to be called out. It's definitely not because I was the loudest, just because I started with A.
On that note, Fridtjof, we're going to shift into the quickfire round. Quickfire round is how we end every single one of our episodes, 120 something, maybe 130 so far. So that's exciting. And it goes with quick answer questions, 30 to 60 seconds to answer each one. Are you ready?
Yes.
Awesome. First question is, what areas, technologies, or sectors excite you the most, but that you find people around you not getting that excited about?
I think I will say food tech. There's a lot of developments happening in plant-based nutrition, in vertical farming, smaller countries or regions trying to be independent in their food supply. We see also from the sustainability perspective how much harm some of the traditional food production is having on the world. So I think it will be a growing market, and I also think that we're just seeing the very beginning of some of these meatless options, as an example, or different substitutes for eggs or chicken, etc. So I think that will be a huge space, and it's probably a big wave coming of shifting behaviors. But when that comes, obviously food is just a massive market, and we're seeing, for example, here in Singapore, that there's quite a lot of startups in that space entering the market. So I think it's probably a bit overlooked by at least a lot of people that I talk to.
We definitely agree, actually. That's cool. Second question of the quickfire round. What would be your top tips for emerging VCs who are now fundraising?
I will say two things. One is think about how you are differentiated. Maybe it's your network, maybe it's your model, maybe it's just what you've done in the past. But really try to make that clear, because a lot of the people you talk to have talked to a lot of other VCs, and even if you don't feel that you are similar, the default reaction will probably be that you are, unless you prove them otherwise. The second thing will be, whenever you talk to a potential investor, always try to end with, is there anyone else that I can talk to from your network who would find this interesting? Because even if someone says no, or it's outside of their mandate, it doesn't mean that they can't be helpful to you. And it's just a lost opportunity to forget to ask that question.
So that's a very good, easy tip, right? I like that one. That last. Third and final question. What is the most counterintuitive learning you've had since you've founded Antler?
It's probably a learning from the industry in general, that in many cases you see that the people who take the most risk and really push the limit, sometimes they end up being the most successful. And I'm not saying that's a great thing, because sometimes it goes wrong and you see that people get into trouble. But it's still the answer that comes to mind, that growing nicely in a steady, safe way, it doesn't always get you there as a startup. And I think for a lot of talented people who are looking to build companies, they come from safer environments and they are building brick by brick and expecting that that's what's going to get them there. I'm not recommending to go and completely throw out the rule book and go completely crazy, but it is worth realizing that probably some of your competitors are thinking in a very different way, and at least adapting elements of that, or studying some of the companies in your area that have really grown fast to understand what they did, I think is important. And maybe I'll add one more there, which is slightly different, but when starting out, and also when coaching a lot of these portfolio companies that we have, I was surprised by how many people are very open to talk about why they failed or why they didn't get to the success they were hoping for with somewhat similar ideas. So I think it's easy to think that if I'm building a fintech company in the B2C space and I call someone who tried to build there and they didn't succeed, that they will be upset, or it will be very painful for them to talk, or they will be angry or protective. And usually that's not the case. People love to share, love to maybe even get involved in your venture. So reaching out to people who perhaps didn't quite pull it off, it's not rude, it's not a waste of time, I think. And people are typically more willing to talk than you might expect.
That's cool. Fridtjof, before I can wrap it up, I have to ask a question that we didn't ask during, and it's good that I asked it this late because we might have to delete it. But I would love to ask you, Fridtjof, why the hell is Antler run out of Singapore? Because you are a bunch of Nordic people primarily. So why Singapore?
So we were starting out in Singapore, as you say, and the initial team are a lot of people coming from the Nordic region. Since then, though, we have expanded to other places, and a lot of the key roles across the company are decentralized. Our head of technology is in the US, our CFO is in Norway, our lead partner on raising capital is in London. So even though a fair portion of the co-founder team is based out of Singapore, it's really a decentralized organization in how we work. Now, how we ended up starting in this region is because some of our team was already based here. Magnus, our CEO, for example, had built a company in the region before, was based in Singapore, and we had a debate on whether to start in the Nordics, where we had good networks and where we had the good presence, or if we should start in Singapore, where we also had a quite good network and presence. And we decided on starting out in Singapore, and it's a very fascinating region. It's just an incredible, young, fast-moving population across all of these countries that falls within this region. And that's really why we decided to take a bet on it. We saw a lot of rapidly moving developments in the region. And I think a good example of that is when I moved here late 2017, it was, I believe, 7 unicorns in the region. Now it's 52, and it's just exploding. And so many people have been part of some of the initial success stories, and they're now turning to build companies on their own. And there's lots of great things to say about the Nordics as well, but it's a different type of growth journey and a different starting point.
That's super interesting. I'm happy you asked that question. Fridtjof, thanks so much for joining us. This was a blast.
Thanks for having me, Andreas and David, and keep it up. Always great to listen to your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the European VC, the go-to podcast for everything European VC. If you love the show, share it with your friends and join our newsletter at eu.vc.